But hello and welcome to today's training hosted by Housing Link. Our topic today is fair housing. My name is Josh Dye. I am the trainer today. I've worked at Housing Link since 2010, so coming up on 14 years now. Before I worked at Housing Link, my first job out of college actually was with the Minnesota Multi-Housing Association, where I was charged with expanding that organization's education programming to greater Minnesota, which included fair housing. And so that's when I first started to learn a lot about fair housing. And now today I am delivering this training. Just 2 tips for you to get the most out of our time together today. Number 1, get ready for those live polls. So if you haven't yet, now's the time to grab your cell phone or open up a browser tab and go to menti.com like you see on the screen here, menti.com, and then enter that code 12637-198. And then anytime I ask a poll question, that's what you will use to respond to it. And we'll see your answers come streaming in on the screen. And within Zoom, of course, if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat function as we go along there. But with that, let's dig into today's fair housing training. And we'll start with a live poll question just to get you digging in. How familiar are you with fair housing? Are you not at all, very little, somewhat familiar, or are you very familiar? You see, what is fair housing? Well, fair housing is about choice. Choice that is not impacted or impeded or reduced because of somebody's status in a protected class. So if somebody's from a specific race or a specific skin color or a specific religion, or if they have a disability, and all the protected classes that we'll cover today, their housing opportunities can't be limited because they are a member of that protected class. And so what we'll look at today, we have actually a wide cross-section of people in today's training. Who do we have in today's training? Well, we have property owners and managers in today's training. We also have those who are case managers, service providers, those supporting renters in today's training as well. And so we're going to give everybody this common language to understand fair housing, discrimination, housing opportunity, so that hopefully we can work more effectively together. But just remember, it really is about a renter having housing choice, and that their current housing experience is not diminished or limited simply because they belong to a one or more protected classes. And so today we'll look at what is discrimination, what isn't discrimination, what does and doesn't violate fair housing law, so that property owners and managers can provide the best service possible to renters, not generate any fair housing complaints, or worse, any lawsuits, and so that renters themselves can also understand when have they or have they not experienced any discrimination as well. So yeah, we got a few folks, not at all, very little. Well, today you will get your immersion class in fair housing. Many of you somewhat familiar, and some of you, you've probably taken this training a bunch of times and your employer forced you to attend this as a refresher. Well, really glad to have you here as well. Next time you can put the PowerPoint together and make this training happen as well. First, let's dig into a brief history of housing discrimination in the United States. Like, how did we get here to 2024 and the fair housing laws that we have on the books, both at the federal level, covering the entire country, as well as in our local levels as well. So from 1776 to 1865, slavery was allowed. I guess this is going a little bit more than housing discrimination, but you could certainly see the implications of that there. But then once slavery was no longer allowed, from 1865 to 1965, discrimination was the law. So Jim Crow laws enforced segregation. But then in 1965, something happened. How did it impact housing? Well, it was legal for property owners and managers to not rent to people because of their race and other status in a protected class. So it was okay during that time. Maybe not okay, but legal for property owners and managers to not rent to people because of their race or position in another protected class. It was also legal for banks to not give loans to people because of their race and status in other protected classes. In many cases, Black people weren't allowed or were discouraged from living in certain neighborhoods before fair housing came along, and some home deeds prohibited homeowners from selling their homes to Black people. So even within our local communities, if you do a little Googling, you can learn about a project to identify what are homes that still have deeds that show that homeowners weren't allowed to sell their homes to Black people. None of those are enforceable now, but some of them are still on the books. And so they were looking at identifying some of those, but certainly that's no longer legal now. But up until 1965, it was. But then in 1964, the Civil Rights Act happened. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964, discrimination was banned in public places and employment discrimination was made illegal. But interesting fact, housing discrimination was still legal from April 10th, 1964 through April 10th, 1968. But the Civil Rights Act really got us on that path to addressing it. But even after the Civil Rights Act was passed, discrimination in housing was still allowed. But then there was a really key moment along this journey. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And you see, there was a fair housing bill that was making its way through the legislature at that time that had lost momentum. And it looked like it wasn't actually going to get passed. But then Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated and riots ensued across the country. And in many cases, that is what led to, or in a significant way, that event and events post really did lead to the Fair Housing Act getting passed on April 11th, 1968. So there's your brief history lesson. And what this did is it established federally protected classes. Now, there was an original set of federally protected classes, meaning these are people that you can't choose to not rent to them just because they belong to that protected class, or somebody's housing experience or opportunities or options can't be limited just because of their status in the protected class. But there have been protected classes added over time, as you will see, and of course, we'll have our full list today. But federally protected classes include someone's race, someone's color of their skin, someone's national origin, so the country that they come from, someone's religion, so their housing opportunities can't be limited or really diminished because they practice a certain religion. Sex was added in 1974. So sex meaning gender, male, female, and that now includes sexual orientation and gender identity. So a few years ago, HUD amended it to include sexual orientation and gender identity. Familial status was added in 1988. So you could see that it actually took quite a bit of time for some of these to get added in as protected classes. So let's do another live poll around familial status. Give us your best guess. Grab your device or go to that Mentimeter section and enter in what does familial status mean? What do you think familial status covers? So we're talking about these federally protected classes, and we looked at everything from race to color of skin to religion to the country someone comes from or national origin, sex, including gender identity and transgender, and sexual orientation and familial status. So let's take a look here. So related to married, single, divorced, and widowed. So that's not familial status, that's marital status. So I love this because I know we've got a wide range of people here, both property owners and managers, as well as case managers. And it's important to understand these things so that we know if somebody that we are working with, if you're on the case manager side of this conversation, if has the person experienced discrimination or not? Is it even a protected class, or do we understand the protected classes correctly? Somebody says who your household consists of, family structure. All right, married versus divorced, that's marital status. Somebody found it here. Children or no children. We'll go a little bit more nuanced to this in a moment. But familial status refers to children under the age of 18 in the household. That's what familial status refers to. And familial status can have big impacts because let's face it, I've got 3 young children. I've got a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and an 11-month-old, and they are really noisy. And my couch is not in the same condition that it used to be in. My home is not in the same condition that it used to be in. And you can see how kids can impact the quality of life of those around them for better. And in some cases, wow, that's a lot of noise. And so over time, you can imagine that there are plenty of property owners and managers, especially before fair housing was in, of like, no, we're not going to have that in our building. But then in 1988, the Federal Fair Housing Act said familial status is covered. You can't not rent to somebody just because they have kids, or you can't force them to live. You can't limit their housing opportunities or force them to live in just a certain unit or on a certain floor because they have children in the household. An exception to this would be buildings for seniors age 55 plus. So they do have some wiggle room there in terms of familial status, but for other outside of senior housing, familial status, children under the age of 18 is a protected class, and that is what familial status refers to. Okay. Disability was also added in 1988, and that particularly pertaining to the Americans with Disabilities Act, and disability was then added in as a protected class for fair housing purposes as well. And so somebody who has a disability, they can't have their housing options or opportunities or experience limited because they have a disability. We will get into later on reasonable accommodation that can have a big impact on both properties, as many of you who are property owners and managers are probably silently nodding. Yes, this does have a big impact, but also has a big impact on the quality of a housing experience for renters who have disabilities as well. Now, so those were the federal protected classes that we just went through there, right? So race and skin color and religion and national origin, the country where someone comes from, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, familial status. But in Minnesota, we have some additional protected classes. And that means that creed. Okay, so what is creed? Well, religion is if somebody practices a formal religion. Creed is more like a belief system. So you can't not rent to somebody or limit their housing experience because of a set of beliefs that they have. And this has not yet been a major point of conversation, but based on how polarized things are politically right now, if they continue to become more polarized, I wonder if at some point we will see political belief or affiliation, set of political beliefs end up being impacted by the creed protected class. I don't know. But if you look at how much tension there is around politics right now, and if creed means belief system, does someone's political beliefs fall under a protected class or not? I wouldn't test it. That's what I would say if I was a property owner or manager, but I'd be really mindful of I guess you could say, the community dynamics that you have among residents. Because one thing you'll hear from me in a moment, but I'll mention it again, that yes, fair housing impacts access to housing, whether somebody will be rented to or not, but it also impacts the housing experience, that we can't allow a hostile environment in a community. So we can't have staff creating a hostile environment, but also residents, if they are being hostile to somebody else based on their status in a protected class, well, then that could impact a rental housing community. And so I would be mindful of where is most of the tension in our world right now? Well, there are a number of different things, but politics is pretty high up there. So you might just want to be mindful of it. Okay, many of you thought in familial status that it was marital status, but yes, marital status. So whether or not somebody is divorced or married, single, widowed, etc., falls under marital status. Receipt of public assistance. So receipt of public assistance means that if somebody gets public benefits, property cannot deny them simply because they receive those, or if somebody was going to have, let's say they are on SNAP food support, or they get temporary assistance for needy families, or some other public programs that provide some income or support to live, a property has to allow that in their calculation for qualification. However, receipt of public assistance does not include housing choice vouchers, But in the city of Minneapolis, there is now a protection for those who have renters that have Section 8 housing choice vouchers. So if you have a property or you're working with clients in the city of Minneapolis, a property can't deny them only because they have a housing choice voucher. Now, within rental housing, there are screening criteria and a wide variety of things that can contribute to whether somebody is eligible, like other than income, things like credit score, credit history, criminal background, those types of qualifications. But housing choice vouchers is only protected right now in the city of Minneapolis. So outside of the city of Minneapolis, properties can still say, we do not work with the Section 8 housing choice voucher program, or we do not accept housing choice vouchers. But in the city of Minneapolis, they can't. So if you're serving renters in this conversation, understand that there are certain jurisdictions that allow certain things where others don't. Housing choice vouchers in the city of Minneapolis versus other places is one of them. In age is a protected class only in St. Paul, and ancestry in Minneapolis and St. Paul. I don't see age or ancestry really pop up too much in the work that I do with Housing Link, but they are protected classes. Just be aware of that. Okay, if you have any questions along the way, feel free to, if you are in Zoom here, use the chat. If you are watching on that web page, there's actually a form down below that you can use to ask questions or make comments along the way, but I'll just keep plugging along here. All right, let's do another live poll question, because we want to be mindful of all of these protected classes, especially if you're a property owner and manager, that you can't limit somebody's housing options because of their status in a protected class, and their experience while living in it can't be diminished solely as a result of their status in a protected class. But there's one more than others that makes the most fair housing complaints. And what I mean by that are those who they believe that they have experienced discrimination because of their status in a protected class. And then they moved forward and made a complaint with either a state agency or in many cases, HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development is one that does that. But which protected class makes the most fair housing complaints? Is it disability? Is it race, familial status, or sex? So gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, reminding you falling under the sex category. So go ahead and go into Mentimeter, grab your device, or if you are watching on that web page, it's to the right of the video window, you can answer that question. Got over 80 responses right now. The majority saying disability, some saying race. Handful of you saying familial status, possibly influenced by my description of my children. Okay. So those of you that said disability are correct. So actually by quite a margin, folks with disabilities do make the most fair housing complaints. Now, this does not necessarily mean, let's look at our words carefully. This does not necessarily mean that then a complaint in every case, or in even most cases, turns out to be that the property was guilty of fair housing discrimination, but it is the perception of the renter. And that's one area where I really like to focus this training on, is that, yes, we never want to legally commit discrimination if you're a property owner or manager, but it can also just be a massive inconvenience if you generate a complaint. So today I take a really, say, cautious approach to fair housing of what are things that properties can do to avoid even ever having a complaint, like being that aspirational around it. Of course, some complaints may still come, but that you approach things in a way that people don't even have the perception or belief that they experienced housing discrimination based on their status in protected class. But it is disability. And the thing that really drives a lot of that is companion animals, emotional support animals, and that nuance of reasonable accommodation, where properties kind of have this kind of challenging dance that they have to do sometimes when they get a lot of these reasonable accommodation requests. And we'll dig more into that a little bit later, and in some ways to handle that. All right, now we're going to do a little bit of a quiz, and we will have a winner of today's fair housing quiz. So the way that this will work is you'll see the answer pop up in Mentimeter like you've been doing on the live poll so far, and you want to get the right answer, but get it as fast as possible. That's how you will win the quiz. For those of you who are watching on the embedded video, because it worked for you, that's great. You are going to see the question pop up before you see it come out of my mouth. So you're watching this on a slight delay if you are watching it on that page, but keep an eye over there on the Mentimeter section because it will pop up before I read the question. Also, while you are getting logged in for these, or you can enter a name in for yourself on this quiz. While you're entering your name in, feel free to enter a name in. If you don't, the system will assign you one. But it's a little bit like bar trivia today, where you got to get the right answer. And if you've ever played on the TV, you got to get it faster to get more points. I think that's how it's set up today. Looks like many of you are ready to roll for this quiz. So let us officially begin with our first question, which is, can a property owner or manager deny an application because someone has a low credit score or, shaky rental history? Is that legal? Can you do that? Can you deny someone because either their credit score is low or they have a shaky rental history? So simple yes or no question here. And you have approximately 10 seconds now to get that answer in. Yeah, so the correct answer here is yes. So outside of the city of Minneapolis, properties can use credit score as a means of denying someone. In the city of Minneapolis, however, properties cannot simply use score. They can look at the client's or the renter's and sort of credit background. So they can pull the credit report and they can see, all right, it looks like they didn't pay certain relevant bills that we believe are connected to rent. So it's a little bit more complex. But yes, outside of the city of Minneapolis, credit score is something that can be used to deny a renter. Within the city of Minneapolis, you actually have to look at the credit report and determine if the areas where the renter has not paid are relevant to paying the rent. But this is a moment where I'd like to talk about how there's an opportunity for some property owners and managers to possibly consider broadening their view on credit. And here's what I mean by this. Not trying to get anybody to do anything that doesn't fit within their business practices, but to look at the reality of the situation. So let's say, just for example, somebody has a lower credit score. So that's a signal of, okay, we might want to look into that. But maybe rather than having an automatic denial, you could look and see, okay, is it something where they've always prioritized paying for their housing, but it's other bills that they have not paid, so that when they're in a jam, they always pay for their housing. So their rental payment history is perfect, but maybe their medical bills, or could even be credit cards or something else, is what's causing the credit issue. That might be somebody who would still be a reliable paying renter because, well, they've always paid their rent on time. And that might be something I would encourage properties just to have that conversation on, because you might actually find you discover some good renters that right now are not qualifying, but that might do just fine in terms of paying the rent. I can even use me as a quick example of this. So about 12 years ago, I was exiting a difficult relationship situation. See, the thing is, in that relationship, we had purchased a townhome in Eagan, Minnesota in the year 2006. Anybody remember the housing market crash? And if they could choose the worst time to buy a townhome in Eagan, Minnesota, probably about December of 2006 when we purchased it. Anyway, 2012 rolls around. The relationship is going very poorly. It ends. We need to sell the house, but it's underwater. We had always made 100% of the payments. We needed to sell the house, but it's underwater. And so in order to do the short sale, they actually said, well, you have to stop paying on this for 3 months. So we had to stop paying on it for 3 months. That impacts your credit. Then you do the short sale and that impacts your credit for about 3 years. Well, I know the system. I understand the system. So what did I do? I found an apartment before my credit score dropped 200 to 300 points. So because I knew the system, I knew I could go and get another place before credit impacted. Still the same renter, still paying at a really high rate. So anyway, it just goes to show that the credit score doesn't always tell the full story. Sometimes it does. In those cases, definitely apply it. But in other cases, you might look at, okay, the credit score is low. Why is it? It's like, oh, well, you were in a relationship and both of you were paying for that rent. But something happened and now you're just on your own. Is this situation stable for you as an individual, even though the background was connected to the relationship, you as an individual? So anyway, just an encouragement to look a little bit further, because it also seems like a lot of cities and localities are kind of pushing towards this as well. So it might be something where you can get ahead of the game and start to determine, yeah, here's where we can show more flexibility and it still be totally in alignment with your business practices, rather than having your arm twisted by the city, for example. Okay. All right, let's take a look at who got that question right. And quickly, well, Kai and Jonathan and MS and Carla and Marin, many of you. Wow, we have a tight leaderboard here. Let's keep going. Okay. Next quiz question, currently loading. Let's get it started. Is a property owner or manager allowed to make exceptions to their screening criteria sometimes? Yes or no? So let's say a property, they have their screening criteria. Here's what we require for income, credit, criminal background, rental history, and anything else. Are they allowed to make exceptions to their rental criteria sometimes, or is that a violation of fair housing? So say yes if you think they can and not violate fair housing, or say no, like they can't do it. They'll violate fair housing. So what do you think? Yeah, the correct answer is actually yes. A property can make exceptions to their screening criteria so long as the reason for making the exception is not based on a renter's status in a protected class. So they couldn't say, we'll make the exception for people because they're this race and then not make it for others. Or they couldn't say, oh, we'll make it for families without kids or households without kids. Others. So you can make an exception as a property owner manager. It just, the exception can't be based on the status of a protected class. So kind of like my story that I shared there, which is like, okay, let's say I had not known the system very well and I would have had to try to find an apartment with a really low credit score because of the short sale. I could have said, hey, here was the situation. And then you could have said, yes, on the basis of what you just explained, that your payment history was perfect up until the relationship ended, but now you meet all the other criteria, we can make an exception for that situation. And you document that's the reason why. It wasn't based on the status of a protected class. It was based on life circumstances are different. Totally legal, totally fine. Not a violation of fair housing to do so. So keep that in mind. And you can do that across any criteria. You could say, yeah, we'll make an exception because they're working with this agency, or we'll make an exception because they submitted a budget and showed us how they will make it work. So I think of income requirements. Sometimes, like a lot of properties, you'll require 3 times the rent and income because you want people to have enough buffer to pay their bills. Sometimes somebody is kind of close. And in those cases, you can say, oh, yeah, we'll make an exception here because you have a really long work history, for example. Okay, so it is allowed. Let's take a look at our leaderboard now. Those in the top 10 seem to be remaining in the top 10, but look, Shelly is up there. Tori is up there now. And Logan was the fastest that time. Nicely done. Dennis came to play as well. All right, let's keep rolling. Want to make one note about making exceptions to screening criteria. So at Housing Link, we do offer support to properties that are considering making exceptions to screening criteria for renters who don't quite meet it. So we have something called Beyond Background's Financial Assurance. The way that works is a renter pays $300. And then as the property, you get access to up to $2,000 above what your security deposit covers at the end of the lease, just like insurance works. Legally, they wouldn't allow us to call it insurance, so we had to call it assurance. Anyway, works pretty similar. Renter pays the fee, the $300. Property gets up to $2,000 above what their security deposit covers. And if you want to refer a renter to purchase that financial assurance and get connected, you can do that if you're an agency tuning in and you're like, okay, we got renters with barriers. So in other words, I'm talking about, you could make an exception to your screening criteria because somebody purchased Beyond Background's financial assurance, and that would not be a violation of fair housing either, because you're making the exception because you're getting extra support, not because they're a status of a protected class. So housing discrimination in the context of fair housing all comes back to, are we doing this because somebody is a member of a protected class? And if you are, then that usually means discrimination. But if the reason that you're denying somebody or making an exception for somebody is not because they're a status of protected class, well, then you are legally fine. Okay, let's go on to our next poll question. And again, if you have any questions along the way, feel free, if you are watching on the web page, to scroll down and fill out the form here in Zoom. I'm keeping an eye on the chat. All right, I'll be quiet now and we will dig into this next poll question. Could a prospect make a fair housing complaint because you forgot to respond to an email or return a phone call? So this is geared towards properties. So could a prospective renter make a fair housing complaint because you forgot to respond to an email or a phone call? You think that that could create some trouble or no? Is that just kind of too small to matter? Yeah, a renter could. And so what are we getting at here? So for those who are working with renters, this is not an encouragement to make a fair housing complaint because someone forgot to respond to an email or return a phone call. But let's just broaden the view for a moment. So we'll look at this from the property perspective first. So if you're a property, the way this could come into play is, let's say you have an advertisement out there and you're really busy. You got a lot going on. Maybe there's a maintenance emergency of the property. Maybe there's some issues with residents going on, but you also have a number of people interested in that unit. And let's just say in the process of going through this, that when you got back to renters, you returned the calls or emails of people that are of one race, and you didn't for people who are of another race. And let's say it was just like randomly happened that way. It wasn't intentionally, just randomly happened that way. Well, let's say the people who are of a particular race that didn't get a call back, that didn't get an email back, they discover, wait a minute, I didn't get a call back, I didn't get an email back, and somebody else I knew that applied for that place did get a call or an email back. Might there be discrimination? So then let's say there's a complaint that's made to HUD or to an agency, and they say, all right, we've got this complaint. We're going to come in. Let's see your call records. Let's see your email records. If they found a pattern of discrimination, that a property regularly was returning calls or emails of people of one race, but not of another, that could create a fair housing discrimination issue. Same thing can go for maintenance requests. Same thing can go for other services that properties provide. And so this is where customer service is often our best defense as properties from fair housing complaints. So let's say, for example, that you have that ad out. It could be useful to set up autoresponders on emails. Hey, thank you so much for your message. We're getting back to everybody in the order that they reached out to us. So imagine somebody emails you about an opening. Rather than relying on kind of our own human error and we get busy and sometimes we go to the top of the inbox, the most recent, not the first one, it might be useful to have an autoresponder. Hey, thanks, we got your message. We're going to reach out to folks in the order that they got back to us, or the order that they reached out to us. And then if we actually follow that process every time, well, then A, we're providing great customer service. B, if somebody made a complaint and then we were investigated by an agency, people can see, oh, they followed this process. There was no, discrimination here. So just being mindful that sometimes, fair housing complaints could get generated from just not having the best customer service processes in place. And that's something that we can adapt to. All right, let's take a look at our leaderboard. I noticed, okay, here we go. Dennis keeps rising up. Who was fastest that time? It was Judy that was fastest, and Judy has rocketed to the top of our leaderboard today in our fair housing quiz. Let's keep on rolling. Into question 4 of 6. And remember, if you're watching this in the embedded video, the question will pop up to the right of the video window before you hear it or see it coming on the screen or hear it out of my mouth. All right, if someone has kids, what unit should a property owner or manager recommend to them? Is it one in the building with the most families? One as far away as possible from senior citizens? One on the first floor for easy entry and exits, or none of the above? Yeah, if someone has kids, what unit should a property owner or manager recommend to them? Yeah, the correct answer here is none of the above, primarily because we're in the context of a fair housing training right now. So what we're talking about here is something called steering in the fair housing world, where you are steering a renter to a particular option and maybe not making them aware of other places. Let's put this in an on the ground reality. So let's say a property, they're trying to have good, peaceful living experience for their residents, try to provide great service, high quality living environment. But sometimes properties have residents who may complain more than others, or they might have that one resident who they're always complaining about noise complaints, or they're always complaining about this, they're always complaining about that. And they're trying to provide good service to this individual while also trying to keep their units full and keep them well maintained and all this. Well, now let's say that I come in with my 3 young children and you have 2 units that are available, and you have one next to the resident that complains a lot and another on a other floor on a completely other side of the building. What should a property owner or manager do in this case from a fair housing context? Well, if I say I'm interested in, a 2-bedroom unit, and those are both 2-bedroom units, then what the property wants to do is say, all right, we have 2-bedroom units available. We have one here on the first floor, and we have this one over here on the second floor over there. Which floor would you prefer? Which one would you like to see? And then the renter gets to choose, because familial status is a protected class, and a property by law cannot not make me aware of units that would be available for me because of the status of a protected class. And so that's why that answer is none of the above. Now, it's totally fine for a property to provide good service and say, all right, we got this unit over here on the first floor. We got this unit on the second floor. Which floor do you prefer? I'd prefer the second floor unit. Okay, great. We'll go take a look at that one. And they gave me the option to see it, but they don't have to show it to me because they identified that I had a preference for something else. So what they can't do is not show me something. And what you as a property can't do is not show something because somebody has a status of a protected class. And even if you think it would lead to more peace in the building. And that's a delicate balance, I realize. But like I said, I take the most cautious approach to this fair housing training. Meaning, let's not generate any complaints. Let's not put ourselves in any kind of legal liability. Judy got it right, but Whole Hop is a little faster there. This is one of the tighter matches. Shelly's in the top 3. Marin, where did Dennis go? Dennis, you were there. Now you're gone. Chanel, Lola, Snuggles, Cake, and Angie C. rounding out our leaderboard. It's going to come down to this final question for our fair housing quiz during today's training. Question 5 of 6. Oh, 2 more questions to go. Pardon me. It'll come down to these final 2 questions. Is it okay to say that a community is great for singles and young professionals? So is it okay for our property to put this in an ad, or when they're showing a place? Is it okay to say, yeah, this community is great for singles and young professionals. This is a lifestyle property that if you're young and you're looking to connect, this is a building that's great for singles. What do you think? Is that okay? Yeah, the answer here is no, specifically because of the singles component of this messaging. So what is a protected class? Marital status. And so if somebody saw in an ad or something that this place is great for singles, that implies that it's not so great for married couples, or it might imply that it's not so great for folks in a protected class. And so that ad would not be good. So you could say, like, in an ad, this property is near the hustle and bustle of the community. Here are the amenities. Here are the nearby things in the neighborhood. And then people can choose, is that property, where it's located, what it's nearby, the amenities it has a good fit for me. It's not based on my status in a protected class. It's based on, this is the property. Here's where it's at. Here are the amenities. Here are the things that are offered. Now the renter gets to choose. Yeah, great fit for me, whether married, kids, or single. So no, that is not something that you would want to say. Instead, you want to focus on the features of a property, the amenities of a property, the benefits of living there, and then the people get to choose. And so if you are, especially if you're a frontline staff, like your leasing agent, you're a property manager where you're interacting with prospective renters, you want to just make sure that you're not sort of steering them on the basis of their status in a protected class, but rather guiding them on the basis of their interests and preferences. We'll talk about that more in a moment, but that's a good shift to make. So rather than looking at somebody and making a judgment of this is what this person of this race will want, or this is what somebody who has kids will want, and I'm just going to assume that somebody with kids would want, the quick exit out. Instead, it's, hey, here's our building. We've got an elevator, or we don't have an elevator. Here are the units that are available. Which one do you think is the best fit for you? And they get to decide, and we're not steering them based on their status of a protected class, but rather guiding them and letting them choose, guiding them on here's what the property is, here's how it works, here's what the community is like, but then the renter gets to choose without their protected class being factored in. Even if you as the property think like, gosh, it's just obvious this is not a good fit for them, and it still is up to them. All right, Marin, you had a nice run going there. That was a tricky question. You're still on the leaderboard. Brandon Brogan is fastest. Judy, Holab, Shelley, Chanel, Lola, and more. It's all going to come down to this as we go to the final question here in our fair housing quiz. And here we go. Should you assume that a Muslim wants an east-facing unit for prayer purposes? Yes or no? And the little monologue that I just did after the previous answer might come in helpful in getting this answer right, where we focus on the features and amenities of a building, not somebody's status in a protected class. Yes, that's always nice to see. 100%. Yeah, we shouldn't assume that. Instead, we could be like, okay, looks like we have 3 units available that match the bedroom size that you're looking for. Can you tell me what's most important to you in a place to live? What are the must-haves? What are the nice-to-haves? And if they're like, it's a must-have if I can have it, an east-facing unit, then great. It's like, oh, that's a nice to have, but it's not a requirement because I can work that out in another way. Like, okay, well, let's take a look at the options, but it's not an assumption like, ooh, they're definitely going to want to see this. But instead, we ask them questions about what's most important to you, what's least important to you, what are you looking for? And then we find the unit as a staff person at the property that matches most closely to their preferences. That's all totally legal and fine under fair housing because the renter is indicating what it is that is most important to them. But you're like, nice to hear, Josh. Let's find out who our winner is. Was it Holahop? Was it Shelley? Was it Judy? Was it Chanel? Well, this is very close. It is Holahop. If you are Holahop, you didn't enter your name, feel free, if you're in Zoom, to put it into the chat, or if you scroll below the video window and find that form, you can let us know that you are the winner. The prize is fabulous. It is congratulations from everybody else watching this training. Okay, so what specific actions are illegal under fair housing law, federal fair housing law, as well as with our local jurisdictional one? So denying an available unit. So meaning, all right, there's a unit that they could be eligible for. Good job, Cindy Cram. Cindy Cram was Holahop, everyone. Cindy, many kudos. I'm curious, how many fair housing trainings have you taken over the years? Or were you just lucky today? Combination of the both, combination of the two. Either way, we're very proud of you. But you can't deny an available unit. So we can't steer them to something that's not a good fit, but also if somebody's qualified, eligible, interested, they have to be able to see it. We can't offer different terms, conditions, or criteria. based on the status of a protected class. So can't offer different lease terms. Like, oh, well, we'll offer 1-year lease to these folks, but we're only going to offer 6-month or month-to-month leases to these folks. That's not allowed. Whatever terms you offer, you can't factor protected class into that. You can factor in other criteria like, well, if somebody has a rental payment history or credit history that is lower or shakier, different terms you can offer to them to show more flexibility is like, oh, we'll rent to you if you do a double deposit or you purchase Beyond Background's financial assurance, or if you have a cosigner, that's allowed because it's based on something that is not a protected class. But so you can't offer different terms, conditions, or criteria based on somebody's status in a protected class. They can't do any steering. So I've already talked about steering a fair amount in my example of which unit should you recommend to somebody who has kids. Recommend whatever unit they are most interested in. Steering means you are showing something to somebody, one thing, but not making them aware of something else. Sometimes we might think, oh, steering's not that prevalent, but ProPublica on the home ownership side of things came out with some pretty eye-opening research on Long Island in New York of steering and home ownership. So check that out and you can see sort of what steering is more about on the ground, but we can't do that steering. Can't do advertising that indicates illegal preferences. So in the fair housing quiz we just did, an advertisement that says this unit is great for singles would be an advertisement indicating an illegal preference, at least in the state of Minnesota, because marital status is a protected class. So that's where some of those dynamics, that if there's a state that doesn't have marital status protections, they could probably do that. We might want to be careful anyway, but advertising that indicates illegal preferences is not allowed in fair housing. And we can't create or allow a hostile environment or have any harassment. So that harassment involves staff, but that harassment also could be resident to resident. So properties, you have your lease terms, and within your lease terms, there are usually things in there about conduct, what is good and respectful conduct. So if one resident, let's say one resident is harassing another on the basis of race. Well, you might be thinking that's between those two. That's not on us. No, not actually. That is where actually the property has a responsibility to say, we have a code of conduct here. You're violating the code of conduct. If it continues, we'd have to, move forward with an eviction. And that would be an example of following through on that, because if you just allow a hostile environment, what happens? Well, renter who is experiencing the harassment or is experiencing the hostile environment makes a complaint. And then now there are a few parties involved that could get caught up in the fair housing complaint. The renter who is doing the harassing could get caught up in that. But the property, if they allowed a hostile environment or created a hostile environment, would also be at risk. So what that means is properties, if they do hear of harassment or hostile environment on the basis of someone's status in a protected class, that makes it a fair housing issue, and you'll need to address it accordingly. We can't make different services or facilities available based on a protected class. You are allowed to have, rules. For example, you'll see some places that say if you're under 16, you can't use the pool or the fitness room without a chaperone, as an example. But other than that, you can't say like, oh, these people from this protected class can use the pool at these times, but not at these times. That would be illegal under fair housing. So think about your apartment unit, apartment community, the different amenities, and just make sure that rules are based on things like health and safety, not based on access based on the status of a protected class. So you couldn't, say like no people under 16 in the pool at any time for standard rental property. Senior housing can get a little bit more complicated than that, but for standard rental housing, we can't make different services or facilities available based on someone's status in a protected class. And you can't limit privileges or access for things to renters as well, but you are allowed to have rules based on health and safety. And you can't deny a reasonable accommodation. So those who are property owners and managers in here know that reasonable accommodation refers to if somebody has a disability They are allowed to request an accommodation to either rules or policies, or in some cases, slight modifications to the physical building, things like grab bars or lever door handles that make it easier for the door to open. So if somebody has a disability, the purpose of reasonable accommodation or reasonable modification is to allow them to enjoy the community or the unit as equally to somebody who does not have the disability. Now, reasonable brings a lot of gray area into this world, but if the accommodation is indeed reasonable, it can't be denied. More on reasonable accommodation as we move forward. You see, fair housing complaints are a major inconvenience, but fair housing lawsuits are expensive and you may be personally liable if you're one of the parties caught up in it. And so we want to be mindful of obvious versus subtle discrimination or intentional versus unintentional. So I'd probably like to highlight, if I were to flip this around, intentional versus unintentional may be a little bit more relevant to what we're talking about here. But there's intentional discrimination where it's like, all right, we are absolutely, not going to rent to folks of this protected class, or they're going to have a different experience here. Versus unintentional would be the example I used earlier where property is really busy, they've had a lot going on, and they didn't return some calls or emails, and it happened to be people of a certain protected class. It wasn't any malice or intention, but it still ended up falling potentially into the category of discrimination, so that we want to be mindful of unintentional discrimination. So what do you hear? What do you see? Why am I asking this question? Well, when you pick up the phone and you hear somebody talk, it's natural for pretty much all of us to immediately have an image in our minds of what that person looks like. Maybe the color of their skin, the country that they come from, their ability or disability, and their age, and many other factors. You might hear kids in the background. So it's natural to see a person, to paint that picture in our heads. We just need to make sure that whatever picture is painted in our heads, whether desirable, undesirable, good or bad, that it does not have any impact on how we serve them in that moment, that everybody gets the same high level of service regardless of their status in a protected class. So that brings us into responsiveness. Who gets the best service? What systems do we have set up to accommodate and support ourselves or our teams in delivering that service, so that no matter who somebody, their background, their national origin, their race, their skin color, their ability, they have ways to interact and engage. Great customer service helps you avoid those fair housing complaints. And at the top of great customer service is focusing on the renter's wants and needs. So I realize at the property side, you've got a really dynamic, sometimes challenging job there, and you're trying to just have the most peaceful community possible. But in terms of great customer service and making it most likely that we follow fair housing and don't generate complaints, we want to focus on what are those renters' wants and needs. How many bedrooms do they need? What rent range can they afford? What floor would they prefer to live on? What amenities are most important to them? What would be the possible best location? And then we show them units based on that, not our preferences, but theirs. And so putting them first in terms of what do they want and need, as opposed to what do we want and need, can go a long ways to not getting us tripped up into any fair housing complaints. And so that means letting each renter know all of the options that match their preferences, and they can choose what they want to see. And then they can choose, once they've viewed them, what is the best fit for them. Now, let's say somebody said, like, I want to be in a really quiet part of the building. Well, if you actually do know, and that's something we want to be sure of, do I actually know this? Let's say you know that, like, yeah, this part of the building is really noisy. You don't have to mention anything about kids, and you shouldn't, because that'd be bringing a protected class into play. But let's say you know that there's a resident that plays their music a little bit louder, and somebody says, quiet is really important to me. You could say, based on my understanding of the property, this unit over here is more quiet right now. That's always subject to change. Renters move in and out. But if quiet's important to you, here's what I would recommend. That's still focusing on the renter's wants and needs. And that could be something that we incorporate. Like if you know your community really well, and it's just like, gosh, that building, it's, it always is really quite noisy. So you could ask, like, what's more important to you in terms of, do you want access to this amenity or this view, or is super quiet most important to you? And then follow that accordingly. Remember, return every phone call and email or set up helpful auto messages. We alluded to that earlier. Now let's do another live poll, and then I'm going to go a little past 1 o'clock here just because we started a little later to accommodate some of our little technology things. But let's go into Mentimeter. If somebody asked you, what kind of people live in this community? If you're a property owner or manager, which many of you tuning in are, how would you answer that? Yeah, so an interesting comment in the chat here within Zoom. I will suggest that immigration status should appear in the Fair Housing Act. Some property owners do not rent to refugees, yet they have legal status on their arrival to the country. Yeah, so this particular training is about just what is, not necessarily what should be or adaptations that should be added. Within housing, there is a lot of room for advocacy and adding things in. And if those were to get added in at some point, I would definitely add that into the training. But yeah, interesting comment and area of advocacy for those who feel passionate about that issue. Okay, what kind of people live in this community? Yeah, qualified persons, all sorts of folks. We have a good, diverse group of people. Anyone that qualifies and meets our criteria. Yeah, so there's a good answer right there. Anyone that qualifies and meets our criteria lives here. Why is this a good answer? It's a good answer because it avoids any indicating that there is a preference for any particular protected class. And so even if you say like, oh, we have a diverse group of people that make up the community, even the word diversity has sort of taken on evolving meaning over time. And so I really like, because I take the most cautious approach. I'm not even saying anything is particularly wrong here, but I go for the most cautious. And I like something, oh yeah, well, like who lives here? And you'd be like, well, any people who live here are those who meet our screening criteria. Here, let's talk about that screening criteria before you move forward with the application, and you just leave it at that. And let's say it's like, oh, is it mostly young people? Is it mostly, some might force the issue, like, oh, is it mostly young people? Is it mostly, older people? And in St. Paul, age is a protected class. Outside of St. Paul, age isn't a protected class. But I also like us to be mindful of like familial status, because sometimes when people say like, oh, is it a bunch of younger folks that live here? They're implying kids, and we don't want to get caught up in that either. And you could say, actually, there's something called fair housing law, which we have to make sure that we don't violate any discrimination laws. So the reason I say that it's anybody who meets our screening criteria is that we're not allowed to talk about protected classes in this context. So anybody who meets our screening criteria, which many of you entered that in, great job. Okay, now as we close, and this is recorded, so if you did have a tight schedule today and you need to watch the recording afterwards, feel free to hop out. But I'm going to close here today talking about reasonable accommodation. We're going to do it with a live poll here. Do you know which animals are allowed to be service animals? Read that question carefully. Go into Mentimeter and enter your answer in. Which animals are allowed to be service animals? And this is different than, say, emotional support animals or companion animals. Those are two different categories as it pertains to this issue. And I do see a correct answer here. So for service animals, it is actually only a dog or a miniature horse. Now, it is on my bucket list to go to a rental property someday and to see a miniature horse. That has not happened yet, but is something. But yeah, a dog or a miniature horse is what is currently legally allowed to be a service animal. However, those of you who are saying any and all are referring to emotional support animals. So let's say somebody has anxiety or depression or PTSD or some other mental health conditions where an animal helps them with that. Any animal can be an emotional support animal or a companion animal, but not any animal can be a service animal. Service animals could just be a dog or a miniature horse. But emotional support animals really could be any kind of animal. So let's talk about these companion or emotional support animals for a moment. So if somebody would have a companion or emotional support animal, if they have mental health conditions like anxiety, PTSD, or depression. And so properties do have to allow for emotional support animals as a reasonable accommodation. Where it enters a gray area, sometimes people have three, and it might be a studio apartment. Let's say somebody has three emotional support dogs, for example, but it is in a studio apartment. A property might actually have, I'm not stating this, everything depends on, the devil's in the details, but property might say that for a really small studio unit that's actually not reasonable, and they could deny that, and they might actually have a pretty decent defense in that. A lot of different factors come in, but I'm just trying to share an example of when might, it's not just a free-for-all for emotional support or companion animals. Properties are allowed to assess it. Or it might be that, let's say, an animal has a history of being aggressive. And even though it is an emotional support animal, that particular animal, if it has some sort of aggressive history, or when a property did a walkthrough with the animal, they saw it lunge at a child or something, that would be a case where a reasonable accommodation could be denied. But what properties need to have is a process by which renters can request a reasonable accommodation or modification. And let's use this companion or emotional support animal. So a renter can verbally request it. You can also have them requested in writing. It doesn't have to be in writing, but it's a good practice for properties to document it. So it can be a, here, what's the request? And properties are allowed to require a doctor's note or from a qualified professional. So properties can say, okay, we will allow this with a qualified professional's documentation that it is needed. But there is gray area in there in terms of what and how many. One of the things that can be helpful for properties, the companion emotional support animal piece tends to sort itself out, but what can be a bit of an issue is when properties might be interacting with people who are just trying to game the system, so to speak, where it's somebody who has a pet that they're trying to avoid pet rent or pet fees. Because remember, if it's an emotional support animal or companion animal or a service animal, it's not considered a pet. So pet rent, pet fees, pet deposits do not apply to companion or emotional support animals or service animals. You have to look at them more like a medical device, like a walker, a cane, a hearing aid. You wouldn't charge a fee for that, so we can't charge a fee for those, but you can have those for pets. So sometimes a good pet policy for properties is their best friend, because it allows just for a little bit more ease in figuring these things out, that if somebody has a pet and the deposits and fees aren't too high, then they can pay them and it doesn't become a reasonable accommodation situation. But anyway, companion animals and emotional support animals, key thing here is that whatever rules you have for pets don't really apply to the companion or emotional support animal or the service animal around deposits, fees. Another thing that we can talk about, and then we're just about done here, is where an animal relieves itself. Sometimes properties have a designated area, and that works just fine. But let's say you had a renter who's got some mobility challenges and their unit is a long ways away from that. A reasonable accommodation might be that their animal is able to relieve themselves in a place closer to the unit, for example. So just keep that in mind as a reasonable accommodation to policies that allow somebody with a disability full enjoyment of their unit. And that's where structural changes to the unit come as well. That falls under reasonable modification, grab bars to the unit, those kinds of things. So, and the changes to policies and procedures. So rules in the community, the example of where an animal relieves itself being one. So what's unreasonable? What could a property deny? Well, if it has an undue financial or administrative burden on the property and they can document, yes, this request, it would cost too much money for us to implement, or it creates too much of a burden, they can deny it on that basis. Or if there's a fundamental alteration in the nature of a provider's operation, so that would be a pretty extensive change, that could be denied as well. Otherwise, reasonable accommodations have to be allowed. Now, who pays for the reasonable accommodation? Well, the property can ask the tenant to pay for it. So in some cases, the housing provider is required to pay for it if they have certain types of federal funding. In many cases, it's both. Sometimes, let's say it's a small change, like, they need a grab bar to make it easier to get off the toilet. They can grab the grab bar. The property could pay for that because that could be used for a long time. Or if we're talking smaller changes, like, can you put on a lever door handle that makes it easier for somebody with limited dexterity to open? The property could pay for that. But there are other accommodations that the renter can be asked to pay for, and that is legal. All right. That is all that I have for you today. For those who are watching this on the embedded video on the web page. You can scroll down below. You'll see a little form that you can use to log out. That'll automatically log you out and take you to a survey where you can share your time together today. Share your thoughts about our time together today. If you are here within Zoom, when you logged in, you got an email that has a link to the survey so that you can use that. If anybody has any questions, I will hang out here for a moment in Zoom. Go ahead, put them in the chat if you have any. If you are watching on the web page, that form down below the video window, you can use for questions that get emailed to me. I'll keep an eye on that, but otherwise, feel free to log out. Thank you for your time together today. Thank you for joining today. Thank you for our time together. And I'll send out a link to the recording for anybody that missed.